have that same conflict and you take it back further, then it is again a religious, ideological war of who is in control and who governs. Is there a higher power that delegates law and justice, or is humanity alone responsible for its future? And this is where Gnosticism comes in, the deification of man. You have organizations in the world like the New Age movement today, which is very strong on the deification of man. You have statements in the Catechism of Roman Catholicism, which basically claim that Christ became man so that man can become God. So this Gnostic element, which you find amongst the Rosicrucians, you will also find very deeply entrenched in these organizations.
Okay, so let's just unpack this a little bit. So we referred to a couple things here. You referred to Gnosticism. You also referred to the Rosicrucians, which, if you look in history, were very closely related to the beginnings of America as a country. The Rosicrucians started in, I think they're what they call the Ephrata Cloister in Pennsylvania in 1786. So we see very early on in America that the Rosicrucians were already here, which are connected to Freemasonry. So they're hand in hand because one of the founders of both, Sir Francis Bacon, was connected very closely with both of those. We could maybe go into that a little bit on another time, but and then you mentioned Gnosticism, which also Albert Mackey says that the G, which is in Freemasonry's symbolism, they have a compass and they have a square and then a G in the center. That G represents Gnosticism. That's what Albert Mackey says, and he's a Freemason author. So we have all these different concepts now coming out from these different societies.
If I were a viewer or a listener right now, and this is all news to me, I've noticed a transition has happened. We've been talking about these high-ranking officials in very public places of power that are money-related, territory-related, governance-related. But something's happened to our conversation, which I think is a very important point for our viewers and our listeners to tune into. We've talked about some of these organizations, Freemasons, Knights of Malta, Knights Templar, Rosicrucians, Golden Dawn, Egyptian mysticism, Theosophical societies, Gnosticism. The conversation all of a sudden has become very spiritual in nature. Is what we're seeing here the missing element that people maybe who are looking in the world and asking what's going on is the missing element around what connects all of these organizations together, a spiritual component. Is that what we're discussing here?
I think that's exactly what we're discussing. In the last episode, we spoke about the capstone of the pyramid that was disconnected. Disconnected to what? To the entire structure, which rests on a very broad base, which is a square, by the way. And the compass and square is, of course, part of the Masonic thinking. Now, who is represented by that capstone, by that all-seeing eye? If you read what is written in the Masonic writings, then they make no bones about it that the power behind the power is what they call Lucifer, the illuminated one, the light bearer. And we have many symbols of light bearing. You have a statue in your country which is called the Statue of Liberty, which bears light, doesn't it? And this ideology of the light bearer, the seething power, as the Masonic fraternity refers to it, of Lucifer in the hands. This is the underlying current. Now this conflict that we were speaking about, which has gone into a very spiritual connotation now, erupts periodically. And normally it is associated with great conflict. If you take the Reformation period, for example, the Reformation was a movement back to the authority of Scripture. And at that time, the Medici family, which was a banking family, a royal family, and a papal family, was actually ruling in Rome. And the Medicis gathered together all the writings of Gnosticism and of the philosophy of Greece and incorporated it in their library. And out of this Medici philosophy, which was the papal philosophy, you had the rise eventually of the Jesuit order. And the Jesuit order, in actual fact, was the embodiment of the Medici philosophy, which was Gnosticism. And if you follow this thread all the way through, and you want to deny that this power has any power in the world other than in a religious connotation, you have to ask yourself, why all the role players, all the major role players in the political systems of the world today come from Jesuitical schools. Whether you're talking about presidents of Europe that were trained by Jesuits, whether you talk about current presidents, vice presidents, or attorney generals, or people on the Supreme Court, they all come out of the same stable at the moment. And they all seem to have Jesuit training or belong to secret societies associated with Roman Catholicism. Like William Barr, for example, belongs to the Knights of Columbus. And if you go to the newest member of the Supreme Court, she belonged to secret societies within Roman Catholicism. And Mike Pence and Donald Trump both had Jesuit education. The people involved in the epidemic, like Fauci, have Jesuit education and are very deeply involved in Jesuitical philosophy. So there is no doubt that these institutions are run by a power structure that comes from that very society with its Gnostic roots.
I just want to be really clear here because it sounds like you're starting to shape a hierarchy for us here, Walter. I think that's important for people to understand. You had mentioned before that we're dealing in these structures, in these organizations, who, when we really get down to it, are all connected through the teaching of this spiritual wisdom. That there are layers, and at the base layer we've got some organizations, but Let's really get down to what I think our viewers and our listeners want to know, and I think it's going to need some context. But can we get a clear answer? Who is at the top of these secret society pyramids? Because you've mentioned this new organization, the Jesuits, several times. Are they the ones that sit at the top of this pyramid?
Well, who do they swear allegiance to? That's the next question. And who is higher? The one who pays the allegiance, or the one who dominates the allegiance? The Jesuit order was created with one view, and one view alone, and that is to restore the power structure of the papal system that dominated in the Middle Ages, and that was lost as a consequence of the Reformation. Now, if they swear allegiance to the papal power, which claims infallibility, and if you trace its philosophy, it does not only have a religious philosophy, it has a political philosophy. and has expended vast means in order to propagate that political philosophy. If you take the religious wars in the world, if you take the structures that have been put in place in order to achieve the social agenda as propagated by Rome, even in the latest encyclical of Pope Francis, then there is not only a religious agenda, there is a very clear political agenda, which, according to Pope Francis, has to be run through the United Nations. And George Bush said exactly the same in his World Order speech, that the United Nations has to be empowered in order to do this.
So then we have all these different secret societies, these subsidiaries that we know are founded from somewhere and someone, which we're tracing this back to this society called the Jesuits. If people don't really know what that is, we should probably go into that a little bit and explain that, because in some of the secret society lodges, let's take Freemasonry for example. In America, they have the Bible sitting at the front. Now, why, if they have the Bible at the front, do they deny the Bible's version of Enoch, and they have another Enoch, this Enoch from Cain, not the one that the Bible is emphasizing? So we have that question there, and then you said that we have these references to Lucifer, which is light bearer, light. So we have this light that's coming from these societies, this knowledge, this something. So how does that, is that all connecting through?
If you go to the 33-degree Masonic Temple in Washington, you will find on the altar not only the Bible, you will find the Quran, you will find the Sancta Vita, you will find the Jewish writings, you will find many of these religious authoritative books on the altar. So in other words, they are basically saying they all form part of a mosaic. Now, you can put the scriptures, for example, on the altar. That doesn't mean that you adhere to the tenet of the scriptures. In Kabbalism, you read not what the word says, you read the supposed code in the word.
So what's Kabbalism, in case people never heard of that word before?
All right, Kabbalism is basically Gnosticism, is basically Rosicrucianism. Kabbalism goes back to the same idea that man inherently is deified. And Kabbalism is a mystic religion where you interpret the scriptures not by what they say, but by numerology. Now, numerology can be taken all the way back to Babylon. And these people run everything by dates and by feast occasions and specific events in the calendar, which become the norm. So the tradition, rather than the word, is the way in which you interpret the sacred writings. So by placing a Bible on an altar does not mean that you believe the literal words in that Bible. It means that you use it as a structure for Kabbalistic interpretation.
So then are Freemasons and Jesuits Kabbalists?
Absolutely.
So we have this concept of this Gnostic ideology. Basically, they're wanting then glorification of their persons.
Well, yes, in a sense, and no. The hierarchy is the one that is actually deified. The hierarchy is lifted above the rest of the populace. That is why in Roman Catholicism has been stated by many popes, lately by Pope Benedict himself. It has been stated quite clearly that the hierarchy of the Church is elevated above the populace, and that deity is particularly manifested in that hierarchy, which is called the magisterium, which is the bishops and the papal system at the top of that. Now this kind of system you can trace back all the way to Babylon, where you had a Babylonian priest king. And he had absolute rule over the political and the religious system. And he had a title, and he had specific powers, and he was deified. And that title eventually came down the line. And eventually, when the Medo-Persians conquered Babylon, these people, this political, religious priesthood, fled to Pergamum. And from there, eventually, it was handed over to the Romans. And the Roman emperor took the title, Pontifex Maximus, and the deification that came along with the title. Now that very title was later transferred to the papal system. And there are many writings in the Roman Catholic system which refer to the papacy as another god on earth. So just as we had in the Babylonian system, eventually you had a deified emperor in the Roman system. So we have a deified God King in the Catholic system to this very day.
So let's kind of summarize what's really being said here for the people watching and listening, because what we started with were political figures and people who rank high in society who are affecting global policy that affects all of us where we live in our families. So if we are talking about Freemasons and Skull and Bones, and now we've identified the organization that kind of operates behind the scenes of all of them, I find it very interesting that you'll hear people talk about the Skull and Bones organizations. You'll hear people discuss the Illuminati, but you don't really hear people discussing the Jesuits. And you've tied in this concept of Jesuit training. Well, are we saying then that this organization that's at the top, that is an order of the Roman Catholic Church, you're going to have some people out there saying, well, that can't be right. Isn't Kabbalism, isn't the Pope a Masonic, high-ranking Masonic Jew? Isn't there some other hierarchy without the Jesuits and the Roman Catholics at the top? And aren't these leaders paying homage to these ancient Egyptian wisdom that's taught inside of these groups? How would you answer somebody who would contest that the Jesuits and the Catholics, mainly the papacy, not the Catholics, because there's good people in the Catholic Church, but mainly the papacy, the seat of the Pope and the Jesuits, are not really at the top? How would you argue that point with somebody who doesn't think that this is really what sits at the top?
You'd have to go, as we discussed in the first one, back to history. The highest ranking God King was Caesar in the Roman system. And he had absolute authority. Now that authority and that title was transferred to the papal system. And that is history. And Vigilus ascended the papal chair with the full title, the vestments, and the authority of a Caesar. And he was proclaimed the corrector of heretics, and he held sway of all government power and religious power in the whole period of the Middle Ages. That was the ruling power. The kings of Europe bowed to that power. if they went contrary to the wishes of that power, they were excommunicated. Whether they were a German king, whether they were a British king, it made no difference. That power held sway. That power lost its authority after the Reformation, and particularly with the final destruction of the political system. So in 1798 this power was lost, but in 1929 political power was restored to the Roman Catholic system when Mussolini gave back the political territory and the political power. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is which religious system in the world is also functioning as a political system? And you will find that model in some Islamic countries like in Iran. And you will find in Roman Catholicism that the papacy is both a political and a religious system. The difference between the two is that in Rome, in the Roman philosophy, the state has a very prominent role to play, separate from the church, but the overall ruler is the hierarchy of the church. Whereas in Islamic systems, the state is also the religious system. Now, which system has diplomatic relations with virtually every country on the planet? Only the Roman Catholic system. So here you have a system that not only has religious clout in the world, and a religious authority in the world, especially in terms of ecumenism and all the religions coming together to liaise with the power in Rome, but also the political powers liaise with Rome. It is the only